The Intercept began right in the middle of the Snowden story.
When I first flew to Rio to meet with Glenn, it wasn't because, oh, we're going to start the Intercept. I had been doing a lot of reporting from the front lines of the Obama administration's dirty wars. So I come to Rio with sensitive information about an insider in the drone program. What we were going to do down there was search through the Snowden archive to see if we could match up what this source was telling us with actual documentation. As we're working on this story together, which ultimately became the first story that the Intercept published, we started saying, well, maybe we should start our own news organization.
In a crowded media landscape where it sometimes feels like there's just too much information coming at you every second from every direction, how do we create something with unique value, a journalism organization that makes an important and distinctive contribution to the world?
The impetus for The Intercept was to do a different kind of journalism than is typically done, one that's more adversarial and that gives journalists the opportunity to have more of a voice and more of a perspective.
We have a responsibility to tell the truth and to not produce propaganda, but I don't think we have a responsibility to pretend that we don't care and that we aren't invested in the outcomes of these stories, especially when, one of the stories that I cover is like whether or not we're going to have a habitable planet. Journalists don't have a spare planet to go to. Like, we really are all in this.
For years, my American wife back in the UK used to say to me, let's move to America. And I'd say, well, who's going to employ an outspoken, left-wing Muslim journalist in the US? Who's going to let me say what I want to say?
In reproductive rights, there's a lot of men walking around out there in state capitals that want to tell me what I can do with my body, and I like to be able to tell them to go fuck off. And I can here.
I'm an opinion journalist, and the point of opinion journalist, at least at the Intercept, isn't just to offer the latest hot take on the latest trending story. It's to try and explain the world with new information, with facts, with figures, with evidence. Where else would I be able to write in-depth op-eds on everything from the situation in Bahrain, to the white nationalists in the White House, to Uyghur concentration camps, to Chuck Schumer being dumb?
At the heart of our mission is a nonpartisan commitment to holding those in power accountable, regardless of whether we like them as people, whether we voted for them as candidates, or whether they have a D or an R or some other designation next to their name.
Politicians don't talk to you because they like you. They talk to you because they have to. You have the news, you're going to report it one way or the other. The Kavanaugh situation, where I first reported that Dianne Feinstein had a letter that she was not sharing, the sources that reached out to me did so because they knew that we were the kind of outlet that wouldn't be afraid to anger Dianne Feinstein, and that if the story was true and if we could confirm it, that we were going to go forward with it.
There are crises all around us, a White House of mind-boggling corruption and racism and misogyny, the casual drone bombing of civilians around the world, caging of children at our borders. The press has a critical role to play in helping people understand the roots of these crises. Our sources are national security whistleblowers, death penalty defense lawyers, civil liberties advocates, immigration activists, and radical environmentalists.
For me, one of the things that stands out about working at The Intercept is the sort of commitment to resources and time for complicated stories. They do not get reported overnight, and we can sort of take the time and get the buy-in to do them right. And if you do those stories right, you can make serious changes in individuals' lives. I've been successful in helping people get out of prison. That's like a really great feeling.
One of the things we're going to be doing is keeping our eye on the year 2021. That's the time when, if all goes right for Democrats, they will control the White House, possibly control the Senate, and possibly control the House.
I think it's empowering when people understand the structures of power that are impacting their lives, right? That it isn't these sort of faceless, nameless forces, that they can be identified and you can expose them, you can extract political consequences and economic consequences. That makes people feel like maybe it's worth engaging politically.
At the end of the day, we feel we did something right when our journalism forces people in positions of power to answer for their actions, but also when it shows that a different path is possible, that people don't need to accept the world as it is. Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's amazing to me to be here and to actually be able to say that the Intercept has been here for 5 years. I've met like young people from time to time, and they tell me, you know, I'm a longtime fan of the Intercept, and I'm like, how is that possible? You know, like you're 20 years old. But actually, it is possible. It's 5 years, so you know, we're really grateful to have the support of our readers and our fans. So, and thank you so much for coming tonight. We're gonna give you some highlights of some exciting ongoing projects. We're gonna talk about our sort of disruptive approach to covering politics in 2020. Not the Silicon Valley annoying kind of disruption, but our kind of disruption. We're also going to talk about what it takes to untangle a wrongful criminal conviction, which is an enormous undertaking journalistically. So we're going to hear from some of our reporters who've actually done that. And we're going to have a sneak preview of a forthcoming project that we're all incredibly excited about. And it's sort of a fusion of politics, art, and journalism, and it's a collaboration involving Naomi Klein, Molly Crabapple, and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So how's that? It's like my job as an editor, when you put like 3 people like that together, is just to get out of the way. So in the 5 years since we launched, our focus has remained on national security, civil liberties, and the invasive surveillance state. But we've also branched out to new areas like the climate fight that are equally urgent right now. But along the way, as you heard in the video, our sort of independent stance has remained in our DNA, and it's probably the thread that links all of our diverse stories, shaping everything we do, including how we define what is news. Sometimes, you know, inevitably, that has to include a Trump tweet when he does something so odious as go after Congresswoman Ilhan Omar the way he has. But when we respond, we try to do it in a way that is distinctive, and we say we don't compromise with that kind of racism, and we call it by its name. But often to us, the news is what we find by putting our ears to the ground and listening to voices that aren't otherwise being heard. So on immigration, for example, our reporters aren't hanging out at press conferences at the Department of Homeland Security. They're like working with, alongside the activists in the No More Deaths movement who are leaving bottles of water for migrants in the desert in Arizona, or they're listening to kids who've been swept up in police gang dragnets. And like when we come to cover the Pentagon, similarly, we're not as concerned with, you know, lionizing generals who were supposedly going to save us from a deranged commander-in-chief, but instead we're covering the wars that are going around the world, from Yemen to Somalia and Afghanistan, using intelligence from U.S. drones to make them more deadly, using U.S. weapons and using U.S. troops, even though we don't call these things wars. If you're embedded in the establishment in Washington as a reporter, you might kind of accept their sanitized view, but our reporters are not. And these look and feel like wars to the people who are their victims, and so that's what we will call them. We also apply this kind of approach to politics in our way. We were one of the first and only outlets to cover AOC and Omar, but also candidates whose names might not be as familiar, like Pennsylvania's Jess King or Delaware's Carrie Harris, who lost, but whose challenges represent challenges to the Democratic establishment that are helping redefine the party and hopefully the future. Because we believe that journalism doesn't just stand on the sidelines and report on the horse race, but actively seeks to expose abuses of entrenched power and shine a light on challenges to that power. And that is the kind of reporting that helps make change possible. So you're going to hear a lot about all of these things tonight. But before that, I just want to acknowledge the larger team at The Intercept that has brought this work to you and into the world. Building and running a media outlet doesn't just take, great writers and editors. It takes a whole team of copy editors, designers, developers, people who produce the visual journalism that really has an impact when you, visit our website, people who work on sending out our newsletters and building our membership program, which is vital to our future, and people who plan evenings like tonight. So thank you to all of the staff that made this possible. I also want to thank our incredible First Amendment lawyers who, really do so much. And we cause them a lot of headaches. And to the stable of fantastic freelance journalists who have shared their talents with us, who have written some of our best stories, and are a key reason why we've had the impact that we've had. You're great. We've also been really lucky to have the unwavering support of First Look Media and its founder, Piero Midyar, who stayed true to his original promise of supporting independent voices and letting them speak, even if they may be occasionally sometimes a bit irritating. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce my friend and longtime co-conspirator, Jeremy Scahill. So you know him, he's the co-founder of The Intercept, he's the host of our podcast Intercepted, which really blows me away every week with its incredibly, bracingly original mix of music, art, humor, and scathing political analysis. It's like nothing you can hear anywhere else, every week. So when Jeremy called me 4 years ago, typically it was late at night and it was incredibly urgent. Everything with Jeremy is incredibly urgent. Like if he doesn't reach you right away on one device, you'll get like messages from every possible device that you have. And it was also already decided I was going to take this job at The Intercept and First Look, which I had been reading about in articles with alarming headlines. And we had worked together for many years, and I was obviously very excited about this. We worked on his books, Blackwater and Dirty Wars, and at The Nation magazine. And I knew he was on a mission, and that's typical for him. And as it was typical for me, I sort of said, okay, this sounds great, but like I have a lot of questions. But he said, no, we have to do this right now. And he's not always right, but he often is, and he was then, and I'm grateful to him for that. Working with him and Glenn has been extraordinary and exhilarating, sometimes a bit of stressful experience, but a lot of fun. And there's always a sense, and maybe it's infectious at this point, that what we are doing really is incredibly urgent. So, Jeremy.
Thank you, Brooklyn, for coming out and representing tonight. Thank you to the Bell House for having us here as well. Glenn Greenwald wanted to be here in person, but he's on Tucker Carlson right now. He will. sorry. He will be coming in live shortly, and we can talk all about that if you guys want. We're 5 years into this experiment, and as I indicated in the video that we played at the beginning, at the very beginning of this, I had no concept that this is what we were going to end up doing. I was working for The Nation magazine. Our editor-in-chief, Betsy Reed, had been my editor for a very long time. She edited the book Blackwater as well as Dirty Wars, and I had wanted us to hire Betsy Reed at the very beginning, and she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't do it for some years, and I had kept trying to convince her, and eventually, critical mass, we got her to come on board as our editor-in-chief, and she's a phenomenal journalist and editor, and just an incredible person to work with. But at the beginning, there were no editors. It was Glenn and myself on his porch in Rio de Janeiro, and I had never been to Brazil before. I had been doing war reporting in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere, And I was working on a story about how the US government was using cell phone metadata and other data emitted from cell phones to triangulate people and then kill them, either in drone strikes or in raids. And sometimes they wouldn't kill them, sometimes they were going to capture them, but often they were trying to kill them, and it was sort of a death by metadata program. And Glenn and I had only met in person a couple of times. Mostly we had a kind of cyber relationship. Thank you. So anyway, I fly down to Rio. Yes, it all sounds very luxurious. I fly down to Rio, and Glenn's house was up on the top of this mountain, and there was no public transportation to get there. It was very remote, and Glenn did not pick me up from the airport. So I fly into Rio. I make my way to Glenn's house. It took me like 4 hours to get from the airport to Glenn's house. I finally get there, and I love dogs. I'm actually a dog person, but there were like an army of dogs coming up to his fence, just like looking like they all wanted to eat me. And Glenn isn't there. I'm trying to text him. There's no cell service. It was his home had been breached recently. His computers had been stolen. We still don't know who did that. And it was you have to remember, at that time, the United States government was terrified about what was going to come out next. There was a hunt going on for Edward Snowden. Glenn's husband, David Miranda, had just been detained at Heathrow Airport in London and was potentially facing charges under terrorism laws in the UK. So it was a very intense period to be visiting Glenn. And I did not know Glenn all that well at all. So I arrive there. I finally get in to the Glenn house. And Glenn is wearing Bermuda shorts and has a dress shirt on with a tie that he's kind of taking off as he emerges from the house. He had just been doing an interview on Skype, and he would wear the Bermuda shorts, the flip-flops, and then he would wear like a suit from the waist up, you know. He was a journalist from the waist up. Anyway, Glenn and I end up getting to know each other, working together, and we're sitting on his porch. And there were, at the time, I think it was 13 dogs. Now it's over 20 at his house alone. Then Glenn also has a shelter that he and David set up for dogs that is staffed entirely by formerly homeless people. But when we were there, it was all of his dogs are there, and there were little monkeys in the trees. And the monkeys would take bananas, and they'd eat them, and then throw the peels at the dogs. And we're sitting on this porch, Glenn in Bermuda shorts, flip-flops, with top secret US government documents sitting there on his porch. And I was there just to work on a very specific story that had to do with the assassination program, primarily through drones. And we were going through all of these documents, and it was like being at Canine Planet of the Apes. Where it was like 90% of the living beings there were dogs, not Glenn and his husband. And while we were talking, Glenn at the time was working full-time for the Guardian newspaper. And he and I both were experiencing similar frustrations with the speed at which we could publish things, and also the edge that we had to our journalism. And we started a very informal conversation about potentially starting our own news organization. And while I was there in Rio, Glenn received an email from Trevor Timm, who is a great journalist, activist in his own right on freedom of the press issues and digital privacy issues, had written to Glenn saying that this guy, Pierre Omidyar, wanted to talk to Glenn. He was considering buying the Washington Post or starting his news organization, his own news organization. And Glenn shared this with me in real time and ends up writing him back. And to make a long story short, the idea that Glenn and I had, which was that we were going to try to get 3 or 4 other people to work with us and start our own very small news organization, ended up becoming a conversation about joining a much bigger news platform. And as I'm sure many of the people in this room know, First Look Media went through various iterations at its beginning, and it had its controversies and fuck-ups and mistakes and all of that. And the Intercept at the beginning was intended to just be one small part of a bigger news organization. But one of the things that Glenn and I both were very clear on, and then I'm going to talk about our partnership with Laura Poitras in a moment, was that we didn't want to have anyone tell us what we needed to do. And Pierre Omidyar was very clear that he was not going to get involved at all with an editorial process if we decided to work with him. And so we end up creating The Intercept, originally as part of a bigger news organization, and then very quickly it became its own thing. Laura Poitras, who had done a fantastic film about Iraq and a fantastic film about Yemen, was working on her film Citizen 4 about Edward Snowden, and the three of us decided to do this together. And from the beginning, Laura's idea was that she wanted to build a video journalism platform. And so we co-founded this institution together, and then in 2015, Laura decided that, or Laura formed Field of Vision, and she formally left The Intercept and has built up Field of Vision, which is an incredible video documentary entity that has done, they have Academy Award nominations, but they've done incredible journalism on a range of subjects, from the environment to repression of freedom of speech to war issues. And so these two entities are part of First Look Media, but First Look Media is a much bigger project than any one of the individual entities. We have grown tremendously over these 5 years. We have incredible journalists that are on our staff. We also have an amazing network of independent contributors, and we have journalists that very much disagree with each other. I often will click on in the morning to our webpage and see things that I don't 100% agree with or 50% agree with. I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to create news organizations where you have a tension between various collaborators, not based on interpersonal conflict, but based on political ideas that are being debated and discussed. Syria, for instance, which I think everyone in this room, everyone who has a brain in their head, is deeply concerned about. We have tried to air a wide range of voices on that, and it's come with all of the complexities that come with debates, particularly on the left. But we've been committed to trying to broadcast a range of views on a variety of issues. Before I bring on our next panelist, I want to say that we are living in an incredibly dire and serious moment right now. The people who are in power in Washington have, on the one hand, fascist tendencies, fascist policies, fascist inclinations. There are active, overt white supremacists in this administration. That is a very serious reality to recognize. This country, of course, was born on white supremacy and continues to be governed by the politics of white supremacy. But the overt nature of the white supremacy of some of these people raises the stakes much higher. When you have someone like Stephen Miller, who is the architect of the entire immigration policy in this country right now, that's an emergency. When you have people at the Department of Justice, William Barr, who is on the eve of releasing the Mueller report, who is known for pardoning war criminals, who is known for his obsession with the unitary executive theory, which is the idea that the executive branch is a dictatorship when it comes to matters of national security, that is an extraordinarily dangerous situation. When you have Betsy DeVos as the education secretary, that is an extremely dangerous reality. And with that, I want to bring on some colleagues to discuss the stakes in the 2020 election. I want to begin by introducing our Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, Ryan Grimm. I also want to bring on our columnist, journalist, Mehdi Hassan. And also our editor and reporter, Maryam Saleh. And I will hand the reins off to Mehdi for now.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very
I'll
much.
see you later.
Thank you, Jeremy. Appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mehdi Hassan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm the host of a podcast called Deconstructed, which I assume you all listen to. Or you are dead to me. Or I will feel about you the same way I feel about Chuck Schumer, which is not a good feeling. We're going to have a chat tonight. Is everyone having a good time? That's good. You were good. But the rest of you, come on, Brooklyn, you can do better. You having a good time? There you go. 5 years, our birthday. We're having a birthday party. So we're going to talk about politics tonight. We've got Ryan here, Mariam here. Give them a big round of applause, our politics team. We also have... I've also got to do a shout out to some of the other amazing journalists in the DC Bureau, to Alex Emmons, to Lee Fang, to Akela Lacey, to Aida Chavez, to Jim Rosen. Give them all a round of applause. They all produce amazing output. So, time is short. We're in DC. It's shit to be in DC right now. Covering Trumpian politics is exhausting. It's overwhelming. Trump years are like dog years. It's just, you can't keep up with it. We try our best. This segment's called Disrupting Politics as Usual, which is what we try and do, I think it's fair to say. We do it at home, not just in our coverage of that tangerine tyrant in the White House, but also our coverage of the Democratic Party's left, which we're going to talk about tonight. We were the first news outlet, Ryan, am I fair? Is it correct to say? We were one of the first news outlets to cover, what's her name, that candidate who ran in New York. What was her name again? Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We were one of the first outlets to be covering, and a shout out to Alex Emmons, the brutal, horrific US-Saudi war in Yemen, long before it was fashionable to cover that war, long before Democrats. So we're proud of our coverage at home and abroad, and we're going to talk about some of it tonight. And I'm going to kick off, and we've got a guest joining us in a few minutes, so bear with us. But Ryan, I'm going to kick off with you. You wrote with Aida back in May 2018, one of the first big pieces on AOC, back when she was launching her primary campaign, back when she was unknown. She only had a few thousand followers on Twitter. What made you say, you know what, The Intercept, we should be covering this story?
It's actually a couple different things. One was simple, and that was just petition signatures. In order to get on the ballot in New York, as probably most of you know here, the machine sets it up so that they can basically kick anybody off that they don't want on. It's the last kind of piece of power that the machine still has. And so you need at least 1,250 signatures to get on the ballot. We had been kind of watching her campaign. Matt Stoller, actually, who's probably fought with everybody here on Twitter at one point or another, had first flagged her. You check her out. She's running against Crowley. This is interesting. And then she filed her petitions and dropped 5,000 in, which is just an extraordinary number which showed real organizing capacity. And when Crowley didn't challenge that, it showed like, oh, this is going to be an actual fight. But the second reason was that Joe Crowley was headed to be Speaker of the House, whether it was in 2019, whether it was in 2021. He was talked about as the next speaker that the Democrats were going to elect, and nobody had any idea who this guy was. So the thinking wasn't necessarily like, oh, obviously this bartender's going to win. It was like, she's interesting. If she doesn't win, she's a vehicle to tell the story of who Joe Crowley is.
Yes,
he's the Chuck Schumer that you haven't heard of. And then as the race went on, it became, oh, she's more than just an interesting bartender. She might actually win. And not only that, she might actually be somebody.
Mariam, you edited Ryan and Aida's piece. You've subsequently written pieces about AOC, about Rashida Tlaib, back when she was running in Michigan, Ilhan Omar. When you were writing and editing these pieces, did you realize, did you anticipate, did you predict how big a deal these women would become in American politics?
Not right away. And I mean, Ryan and I interviewed Rashida Tlaib in March, and we wrote about her primary at that time. And I think we were one of the first national outlets, or the first national outlet, to cover that race. And then we did the AOC profile, and then Ilhan Omar, who had made history as the first Somali American lawmaker elected in Minnesota in 2016, decided to run for Congress, and I wrote about that. I interviewed her for that. And I think it was after Rashida won her primary in Michigan, it started to become a little clearer that something was going on here, because she went out to Minnesota to help Ilhan campaign. AOC got involved and was campaigning for Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts. And at that point, it became clear that if these women win their primaries, they're going to go to Congress and they're going to do something big together.
And yet, even at that point, a lot of mainstream publications were not connecting the dots in the way that maybe you and Ryan and Aida and others were. I've got to ask you this question, Mariam, given what's happened in recent days. As one Muslim to another, especially to one in a headscarf, what do you make of what is going on right now when you see media outlets on the right, the President of the United States, speaking about Ilhan Omar in the way that they've been speaking? What is your reaction to that?
I think when Ilhan was elected to Congress, it sent a message to a lot of Muslim women, her victory and Rashida's victory, that this going to Congress, winning elected office, it's within the realm of possibility. I've never been somebody who's ever been interested in politics, but I also never thought that there was room for somebody who looked like me in politics. And so they made it to Congress, and it was like, okay, this is possible. But now you see the hatred and the vitriol that's directed toward them and the bad faith attacks, and it's like, there's a cost, and it's not going to be easy, and this is just the beginning. And it's going to be a long and ugly fight.
And, I mean, we're joking about Chuck Schumer, but on a serious point, Ryan, 6 days since this was all kicked off. I checked his Twitter feed today. He's tweeted about Julian Assange, net neutrality. He's tweeted about all sorts of random things. Notre Dame Cathedral, very sad. He's tweeted about that. He's not said one word about a fresh woman congresswoman who is under massive assault from the right.
Right, and I think a lot of people are quick to say, and Nancy Pelosi has at least commented on it. It was pitiful in the way she did with her, with Steny Hoyer, with Chuck Schumer. People are quick to say that these people are cowardly, that is cowardice that's being betrayed here. But I think that might be giving too much credit. Like, what if they're just doing what they want to do? Like, what if this is them? Like, what if they're revealing themselves here? This is not that they want to do something different and they're afraid to.
They just don't give a damn.
This is what they want to do. And this is
I've
who
said
they are.
I've said it, I'll say it again here. If anything happens to Ilhan Omar, the blood will be on Steny Hoyer and Chuck Schumer's hands, not just on Donald Trump's hands. I'm sorry.
Right, and this is not a consequence that meets the scale of what you're talking about, but he's also up for re-election in 2022.
Yep. We got a guest waiting online. Before we do, I just want to ask to set the scene very quickly. Ryan, foreign policy reporting. You've led the pack on the Middle East. UAE, MBZ, MBS. Back when the Tom Friedmans and Nora O'Donnells of this world were, I can't use the right words, in relation to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, you were reporting on some of his abuses. I was writing open letters to Oprah on The Rock saying, what the hell is wrong with you? You said at the time that, MBS was talking about Jared Kushner being in his pocket, which kind of defined the relationship between these two spoilt brats. Again, just like with AOC, what brought you to that story, very briefly?
Well, they're just such perfect characters. They're two princes. And they so very clearly, both of them, Jared and MBS, very clearly do not deserve to be in any position of influence or power, yet because of the corrupt systems that each of them have come up in, find themselves in these rooms together. And to see the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia clowning the Crown Prince of Washington, it was just too delicious. And the Middle East is a very complicated place, but people understand what it means when you say, he's in my pocket.
They do understand that. And Mariam, one thing to you, our Yemen coverage, which you've been involved in as well, why is it so important in your view?
There are a lot of things going on in Yemen, and a lot of our coverage, which Alex Emmons has done a lot of, is covering the U.S. involvement in the Saudi-led war against the Houthi rebels, which started in March 2015. But another thing that's going on in Yemen, which I think has been underreported the last few years, and that we've continued to report on from time to time, is the U.S. drone war. And, that's one of the Intercept, to me, for a long time was synonymous with coverage of this drone war that many other outlets would not touch and the civilian casualties that have come as a result of that.
That is a great segue to someone who's going to join us now, someone we've covered at The Intercept, someone who has led the charge on Capitol Hill to end the war in Yemen. Congressman Rob Conner joins us. He's literally... This feels like that James Corden sketch where he's kind of driving and talking to us. Congressman, can you hear us? It's Mehdi, Mariam, Ryan, and a few hundred people in Brooklyn.
I can. What a great celebration. First of all, congratulations on the 5-year celebration. You know, it's a sad time actually to be on because Donald Trump just vetoed, as you know, our resolution, Bernie Sanders and my resolution on Yemen. But I've got to tell you, we would not have gotten this far if it weren't for the Intercept's coverage of Yemen. I personally know members of Congress who read articles in the Intercept, and that's why they signed on to our resolutions.
Just let me ask you this. I know it might sound like a dumb question, obvious, but I've got to ask, why do you think it is that a conflict like Yemen, where the UN have said it looks like the apocalypse on the ground, where the US is heavily involved, as we know, why hasn't it got the coverage from other media outlets over the years that it deserves to have gotten, in your view?
I think there's a concern, frankly, about ratings and what people read. And most media outlets have been focused on more salacious stories that involve the president or that involve politics or that involve polls. And it's not always going to get the most clicks or get the most views to be writing about Yemen. That's why it's so important for the space to exist for the Intercept, where they can cover issues of great moral gravity, issues that decades later we're going to say those were the defining issues of the time, but it may not get the highest ratings or the most views.
Ryan Grimm is here. Ryan and I were just talking about the AOC phenomenon. You were the only sitting member of Congress to endorse Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when she made her primary challenge. She has a few supporters in the room tonight, it appears. Ryan.
Well, that was largely a part.
I'm gonna hand it. Ryan wants to ask you about that. Let Ryan come in.
Yeah, Congressman, I wanted to take you back to that night. Kind of two-part question. Was that, my understanding, was that endorsement that you did of Joe Crowley, was that from months ago that he just dragged up because he was feeling pressure? And what was your thinking that night as you were kind of getting lambasted on Twitter when Joe Crowley put that out, and then you kind of rethought it and then came out with the endorsement of Ocasio-Cortez?
Yeah, well, I had endorsed Joe Crowley months ago. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it was at 9.
So Joe Crowley owned himself by putting that endorsement out.
You know, so and he used it, and I had endorsed it because when he had gotten on Medicare for All. But I honestly didn't know much about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and again, it was in part your reporting, Ryan, and a few others who brought her story to my attention and who helped explain the momentum she had and the organic support she had in the progressive community. So I was very pleased that I did the right thing and endorsed her eventually. But I wouldn't have done that if I had just relied on the mainstream reporting or news, because I wouldn't have known much about her. So again, a case where I looked at your reporting.
I don't know if you know this, Congressman. People in the Ocasio-Cortez campaign say that they would not have had that go any other way. But because the bizarre way that unfolded with Joe Crowley releasing this months-old endorsement, and then you coming out and saying, well, actually, I've studied your opponent a little bit, and I'm endorsing her too, created so much buzz, not just on Twitter, but also ended up with some articles written that it raised her a ton of money. And they think that was a critical moment in her campaign.
We're running short on time. I'm bringing Mariam. Congressman, I'm going to bring Mariam Saleh in, who's here from our DC bureau. And I think Mariam wants to talk to you about Yemen.
Congressman, as I'm sure you're aware, the U.S. is involved in 2 wars in Yemen, and the monumental passage of the War Powers Resolution Act, despite the president's veto, was a good step toward ending one of them. But the other war is the drone war. The U.S. has been involved in drone warfare since 2002 and has killed more than 1,000 people in 3 different countries. And some have asked, when are the progressives in Congress going to take on that war and a demand to an end to the droning of Yemen and Somalia and Pakistan that has killed so many civilians?
Well, I appreciate very much your reporting, and I agree. They're 2 different efforts. One, our War Powers effort, which is to stop the Saudi bombing of Yemen and to call on the Saudis to lift the blockade so we can finally get food and medicine. But I hear you on the drone attacks, and Trump has come in and taken away a lot of the ethical safeguards or considerations. And I would argue that they were inadequate even in the time of the Obama administration. So my view is that Congress should have a clear ethical framework for the use of those weapons, that we should, one, require the Pentagon to report properly the civilian casualties that often result, because there isn't even a clear reporting requirements, and often we don't even know the civilian casualties, and that we should have clear guidelines about when the appropriate use of these strikes may be, and where they cross human rights lines. And so I do think that that's a project for Congress to do.
Congressman, one last question before we let you go. We were just talking. He's still there. He's still there. One last question before we let you go.
I'm not ducking the tough questions.
No. Well, we haven't finished yet, Congressman. Let me ask you this. Something we were talking about before you popped up on Skype. Right now, as we speak, colleagues of yours in the House, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and especially Ilhan Omar, people are trying to kill them, encouraged by the President of the United States. The leadership of your party, in particular in the Senate, is doing nothing about it. What do you say to them?
I say put yourself in their shoes for a second. Take the politics out of this. You're a freshman member of Congress. You're a woman of color. You're of Muslim faith, or in certain cases with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being trashed on Fox News all the time. And the most powerful person in the world, the President of the United States, is going after you. And I think when you look at that extraordinary power differential and what these members are going through, anyone with any sense of decency will say, stop targeting these freshman members of Congress, stop microanalyzing every word they say.
Hold on, Congressman. If anyone with any sense of decency says that, does that mean that Chuck Schumer has no decency?
Well, I hope Chuck Schumer will listen, and I think he should support the call for more security and for Trump to take this down. Look, Chuck Schumer remembers one of the things I think that is not clear to people is how vulnerable and how insignificant, frankly, you are as a freshman member of Congress in terms of power. And we somehow forget the extraordinary power differential that exists in these dynamics. And I do think it's the responsibility of leadership to speak out against these threats, to understand that these women and women of color are at risk, and imagine women of color who aren't members of Congress and what message this is sending to them. And I hope Chuck Schumer will speak out about it.
Congressman, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy your Californian sunny afternoon drive. Thanks for taking time out for us. Give it up for Rob Conner.
Congratulations for 5 years.
Oh, you can see who's up next on Skype there. Little glimpse there. He's not on Tucker. He's on this show tonight. We're going to leave it there. I'm going to give last word to Ryan and Mariam. 2019, rest of the year, what is your priority?
Congress is a major priority, especially the House, watching what the House progressives do in their battle with the House leadership, because it sets the stage for 2021, which could be a critical year.
Mariam?
In addition to that, I think as we keep our eye on 2020, it's not just about the presidential race, but the House and Senate races that are going to be going on, and I think you're going to see a lot more from us on that.
All right. Thank you very much. We're going to hand back to, let me just say this. Last year I launched a podcast called Deconstructed. It was very hard work to launch a podcast. It's very hard to launch a podcast when there's already one podcast at The Intercept. It's an amazing podcast. This man is a legend. I'm going to hand back to Jeremy Scahill, host of Intercepted, who is a very hard act to follow.
All right, so we're at 9:05. Glenn is on Laura Ingraham right now. Can we get the live feed to go? No, I'm just kidding. You know, when we started the when we started the Intercept, originally the very first idea was that it was just going to be focused on reporting on war and espionage and privacy, but we felt that one of the main issues in this country that needed to be confronted in the United States was the treatment of people who are being targeted by the police, who are being targeted by the death penalty, who are being targeted by the prison industrial complex, who are being targeted by poverty. And yes, I say targeted by poverty because poverty is not just something that people are born into, it's something that is manufactured, that people then are forced to live in. And as we started to think about the structure of how we were going to report, not just on the world, but on this country as well, we felt that we needed to build a robust team of people to cover what is generically referred to as criminal justice. And one of the first people that we hired at The Intercept was a fantastic journalist named Liliana Segura, who has spent a very long time covering a number of issues related to the so-called criminal justice system in this country, but more specifically to the issue of the death penalty. This is a country whose state regularly murders people, abroad in wars, abroad in occupations, abroad in drone strikes, and domestically at home in the United States through the administration of the death penalty and through the administration of police extrajudicial killings. We, of course, all know about the strangulation death of Eric Garner in Staten Island. Not so far from here. You can drive a little bit down, go over a bridge, and you're there. Where this man, this father, this grandfather, this man was strangled to death by New York City police officers on the suspicion that he was selling Lucy cigarettes. He didn't even have Lucy cigarettes to sell that day, but that's an irrelevant point. He was strangled to death by New York City police. We see this in cities across this country. The Chicago police murdering people. The New York police murdering people. The St. Louis police murdering people. Trayvon Martin was murdered by a wannabe policeman. We live in a country and in a city where if you are not a white, straight male, it is open season on you if you come in contact with law enforcement. That is part of covering U.S. wars. These wars are not just abroad. It's not just occupations and bombings of foreign countries. There are occupations, and at times there have been bombings, if you look at MOVE in Philadelphia, of black communities in this country. And one of the things that we're trying to do is draw those connections. I have long said that it has been a systematic failure of largely white anti-war movements to make the connections domestically in this country to what the FBI does, to the surveillance programs, to the extrajudicial killings, to the watch listing of people, tracking them down. We have seen in Chicago what it looks like when people go abroad in America's foreign wars. They learn the intelligence techniques, they learn the torture techniques, and then they bring them home to this country. Two of our great journalists covering what is generically referred to as criminal justice, but really is about the war in this country against the poor, the war in this country against people of color, the war in this country against trans women, the war in this country against people who don't look like, well, not many of us look like Donald Trump, but people who don't look like straight white males. That war is real. It is intense. And we as journalists have an obligation to cover it, to confront it, and to report on it. So let me welcome my colleagues, Liliana Segura and Alice Speri, both of whom have spent many, many years, most of their adult life, covering these very issues. Alice and Liliana. You got it.
Thank you, Jeremy. I think what he meant to say is we're going to lighten the mood now. No, not really. But it's really a privilege to be here and sort of have an opportunity to reflect on the past 5 years. I was here from the beginning, before The Intercept was The Intercept, and it's been really exciting to have a role in shaping our coverage and sort of, the beats that have come to define us. And so I just wanted to start by saying, when we had this opportunity to start and create The Intercept and create a sort of criminal justice beat, we were in this kind of exciting moment where we could imagine a dream team of reporters who we wanted to bring on to do this. And one of the first people I thought about who I wanted to bring on to do this alongside with me is, she's not here tonight, but it was a journalist who I had long admired, who was not here in New York, but she was based in Texas. And her name is Jordan Smith. And she is, yes, she is a total badass investigative journalist who was sort of one of my role models in life. I would read her coverage of the death penalty and of wrongful convictions in Texas and think, I want to do what she does. And so when we started The Intercept and we had an opportunity to sort of recruit people, she was the first person I reached out to. And since then, the past 5 years, we've been able to work side by side, do collaborations. I've edited her work. I've also, reported alongside her. But in the meantime, the criminal justice beat has expanded, and we've brought more people on, and it's sort of grown to include policing and immigration enforcement and all these other sort of forms of state violence, which is sort of what we cover today. Mm-hmm. And Alice, of course, is one of our important people doing that. So.
And when I joined The Intercept a few years into it, I always loved reading your stories and Jordan's stories and your investigations and deep dives and really long stories sometimes. But one thing that was really cool this year was to see you guys take that reporting to a different space with your new podcast, Murderville. And I don't know how many of you guys have heard about it or checked it out. Definitely do so. It's really incredible. And I think one of the cool things about the podcast model is that it allows you to look at how the journalism is actually done and what it takes to do this kind of reporting. And I think that's especially important now because, we consume a lot of journalism, but we don't necessarily always understand what goes into it and what it takes. So if you don't mind telling us a bit more about how that project came about and what it actually took to tell that story.
Yeah. So the story kind of came to us in a pretty ordinary way, actually. A lawyer who's based in Georgia wrote to me and basically said, there's this case that's really screwed up, and you should look into it. And the name of the person at the center of the case is Devanya Inman, and he's serving a life sentence in Georgia for a crime that he almost certainly didn't commit. And the more she sort of explained, there's sort of the familiar hallmarks of potential wrongful convictions that are always a little bit alarming. But as I shared this case with Jordan and we started reading the police reports and reading through the trial transcripts, it really was kind of like next level. It was, a situation where you had witnesses who had recanted on the stand, multiple witnesses, saying, I didn't actually see what I said I saw. You had cops and prosecutors who were like, you couldn't make up the kind of rogue gallery that they represented. And one of my favorite early examples that really made me just stop and lean back and be like, what the fuck, was this DA who in his official capacity had been, he eventually was brought up on federal charges for being accused of sexually assaulting a drug informant, including in judges' chambers. I mean, that's how sort of brazen some of these actors were. That guy, spoiler alert, went on to, he's no longer a prosecutor, now he's a Baptist preacher and a part-time boat salesman in Nashville, Georgia. So he was fun. You'll hear his voice on the podcast. But sort of the more we started to read about some of these people who had sent this guy to prison for the rest of his life, the more we sort of saw red flag after red flag after red flag. And basically it led to, well, I should probably tell you what Devania Inman was accused of doing. Devania Inman in 1998 was accused of killing a woman named Donna Brown at a Taco Bell in South Georgia in a tiny little town called Adel. And so in the fall of 2015, we took our first trip to Cook County. And I mentioned all these red flags. The biggest red flags that we found in this case wasn't just like the conviction of Devania Inman. It was that in the span of like a year and a half, 2 years, after Devania Inman was sent to jail for these crimes, a series of additional murders, other murders kept happening in this tiny little town, which really kind of, called into question, the original conviction, and made us really think that something is not right in this part of Georgia. So we went down to Cook County in 2015. We did what sort of journalists do. We knocked on doors. We, hoped people would talk to us. A lot of doors were slammed in our face. It was, that's to be expected, except for this time we were carrying audio equipment, which was really different and new for us. So that made it sort of additionally awkward. But we sort of muddled our way through, and the process was sort of otherwise very familiar. What I will say, and I won't, without giving too much away, the place we were at was very unfamiliar. I mean, I'm now based in the South. Jordan is based in Texas. The South is not unfamiliar, but this particular part of the world was really a place that is emblematic of sort of a good old boy dynamic and history that was really disturbing, especially when you're talking about a black man being sent to prison for life for the killing of a white woman. And so rather than try to summarize any remaining part of the story, we've got a trailer that should give you a taste of what Murderville is all about. So if we could play that trailer.
I mean, it's not like a brutal murder during the course of an armed robbery was a routine daily event in this part of the state, right? This is something that happened very, very infrequently.
Adel, Georgia, a town of roughly 5,000 people not far from the Florida state line. In 1998, there was a shocking murder there.
Police investigators quickly put a man in jail for the crime. He swore he was innocent.
Basically, they was gonna get somebody black for killing that lady.
But then, some 18 months later, a second brutal murder.
And just months after that, 2 more.
You see something savagery like that, it's like, somebody that does that is a straight psychopath.
And the chance of 2 different people doing the same kinds of things, I mean, it just seems kind of crazy, right?
I'm Jordan Smith.
And I'm Liliana Segura. We're reporters for The Intercept. Together, we have more than 30 years of experience investigating wrongful convictions.
We know how they happen, and how putting the wrong person in prison for murder means a killer goes free.
Murderville, Georgia, a new podcast, out now from The Intercept and Topic Studios.
You guys should definitely check it out. And, this story is an incredible story, but at the same time, we, as you said, we hear screwed up stories every day covering this beat. I mean, our beat is this endless pit of misery and injustice, and we're constantly pissed off about something, which is really what motivates most of the writing. But what about this story in particular? Because there are so many others like it, and yet it's so unique. So what made you want to tell this particular story?
Yeah, so I think that it had a lot of familiar elements, but one of the things that was the most sort of striking, and it continues to be exceptional in the sort of scheme of the stories that I've told, is that, here you have, we often say when we're covering sort of innocence cases, wrongful conviction cases, that one of the tragedies of a wrongful conviction is not only that an innocent person goes to prison, but that, the guilty party is free to harm a community again and again and again. And that's often an unseen toll of these kinds of miscarriages of justice. Except for in this case, in this place, it wasn't unseen. We know, and it's not giving too much away to say that at the time, soon after Devanya Inman was arrested for this crime, there were rumors about another man who was actually the guilty party. And police and prosecutors ignored these rumors and moved forward with the conviction of Devanya Inman. This man, who was rumored to be the actual guilty party, went on to murder at least 2 more people in this tiny town. And not only is that sort of an undisputed fact, but now we know that there is DNA evidence that that not only exonerates or should exonerate Devanya Inman on a key piece of evidence linked to the first crime, but it actually implicates this other man who should have been a suspect all along. So these are facts. I mean, we sort of introduced this fairly early into the podcast, and despite these facts, despite the power of DNA and our sort of belief that this has the power to exonerate people, the state of Georgia has not done anything to correct this miscarriage of justice, and Devanya Inman remains in prison for life right now. So I wish I had sort of a better update, and his case remains in the courts, but that sort of on its own, that sort of clear drawing that line, you know, the consequences, the additional toll, the injustice upon injustice, that was really exceptional. That said, you know, there's a lot about this case that isn't exceptional, and one of the reasons that it's so important to me and to Jordan to continue to tell stories about wrongful convictions isn't because like innocence and the problem of innocent people in prison is like the biggest problem that faces us in the scheme of our mass incarceration system. That's not at all the case. But it is, these stories prove to be a really valuable lens through which to see this system that's so imperfect, that's so unfair for the guilty and the innocent alike. And it really lays bare those flaws, the racism, the inequality. There's this idea that it shows whose lives actually matter, right? You know, whether you're a victim of violent crime or whether you're a defendant, on trial for your life. You know, does the state really care about getting it right? It shows, there's this idea of the presumption of innocence, right? You know, we're all innocent until proven guilty. Except for in the real world, we know that that's not actually true. You know, some people don't actually enjoy that presumption of innocence. We know that. We learn that lesson time and time again. And finally, we learn about the ways in which entire communities are criminalized by virtue of who they are, where they live, where they come from, who their families are. And that really kind of brings me to your work, Alice, because that's so much the kinds of stories that you tell. And again, just to say, I cover the South, Jordan covers the South, Murderville takes place in the South, but a story like that could take place literally in any community in this country. And so we find ourselves here in New York, and I want to give Alice an opportunity to talk about that work.
Sure. So I actually started covering criminal justice and policing, and particularly the ways in which they intersect with race and racism in this country before I joined the Intercept in 2014, around the killings of Eric Garner here in New York and Michael Brown in Ferguson. And what I was really interested in looking at was, Mike Brown and Eric Garner were killed because of the over-policing of their communities, and as Jeremy mentioned earlier on, I wanted to understand what is the system that allows for somebody who's selling loose cigarettes on a sidewalk, or somebody who's walking off a sidewalk to the middle of the street to get killed by police. And that's when I really started covering policing, mostly in New York, because I'm based here, but also in St. Louis and Baltimore and a few other places. And at the Intercept, I was really given an opportunity to dive into the stories and kind of like their bigger context in a way that I hadn't really been able to do before. And a case in point is a story I'm working on right now that I actually started working on several years ago. And this was back in 2014 when I wasn't at the Intercept. The Manhattan DA and the NYPD announced that they had just carried out the largest gang takedown in New York City history. And they basically had gone into 2 public housing projects in Harlem, arrested 103 people, mostly very young Black and Latino men, and accused them of various crimes, and basically of conspiring to commit these various crimes, and mostly used Facebook messages and social media posts as the evidence against them. And at the time, I was in one of those jobs where you basically have to write 3 stories a day, and I didn't have a whole lot of time to go out and talk to these people and kind of question the official narrative. And so I, along with a good chunk of the New York media, kind of like ran with the press release from the DA's office, and that was the narrative that was out there. But it always really bothered me, and I always felt really ashamed of sort of the way I'd covered that story, and kind of kept thinking about it. And if you fast forward to 2016, I was at the Intercept, and we had another bigger, largest gang takedown in New York City history. And this time, it was 120 people in the Bronx, again, mostly black and brown young men. This time they were actually charged on RICO laws, which is like a federal conspiracy statute that was actually written to go after the mafia and real organized crime. And there had been some instances of violence in this community, but the people that had been responsible for it had already been convicted, were doing their time in state prison, were brought back out, charged in federal court, and then all of their friends from childhood and all of these people that loosely being connected with were also charged, even though most of them were only really caught over minor crimes, mostly selling weed, really. And so I started reporting on that story, and because of the way the criminal justice system works or doesn't, almost everyone pled guilty. In that case, only 2 young men went to trial and were completely penalized for it.
So the 3-year anniversary of this 2016 raid in the Bronx is next week, and there's some plans to sort of observe that and commemorate it. So So as I said, we've been covering the story since it first happened in 2016, but we'll have a story later this week that actually looks at the breakdown of those 120 cases and what happened to these people. And then we have a new film by filmmaker Stephanie Tankilison, who spent more than a year. She's somewhere in the room, so shout her out. And she spent more than a year following one of the men that was caught into this raid. And then the other thing that I want to add here is that ever since I joined the Intercept, it was really important for me to do the reporting, but also bring this reporting back to the communities I actually write about, and particularly around issues of surveillance, which was a huge part of this story, and is a huge part of, obviously, everything the Intercept does. It was really important to me to kind of remember that, yes, surveillance impacts us all in different ways, but it really particularly insidiously impacts those people that are already over-policed and already criminalized, like the people at the center of this story. And so it was important for us to not just do this story, but actually connect with a lot of grassroots groups in the city. And there are a lot of people doing really amazing organizing work, and we hope our story and our film can be a tool for that work. And so as part of that, we're doing 2 events, 2 community screenings and discussions, one at CUNY Law School on April 25th, and one at the Bronx Defenders on April 27th. You're all welcome to join. And I guess we'll just end it, showing a little clip from the film, and I hope you all check it out and come join us. Thank you.
Yeah, bitch, I'm back in my bag, I don't care. Bitch, I'm back in my bag, I don't care. Roll it out, put some smoke in the air. If you love me or you don't, be aware. My attitude is like, fuck it, I don't care. Bitch, I'm back in my bag, I don't care. Roll it out, put some smoke in the air. If you love me or you don't, be aware. My attitude is like, fuck it, I don't care. Okay, I'm back in my bag.
How you feeling, Craig?
Good. Happy to be here. Bo, they ain't want me free. Yo, he was not here last year, bro. I was in the cell shaking Pepsis, you heard? Like, you know how that shit go. Yeah, that way. My name is Craig Lewis. First nickname is Flock. And when I was younger, they called me K-Murder, and this name kind of got me indicted. But this is the hood life. This is where we grew up at. I mean, so if you take those young boys, and those young boys, put them together and give them a name, they're getting indicted.
Today we announce what is believed to be the largest gang takedown in New York City history. We have charged 120 defendants in 2 rival Bronx street gangs with racketeering, narcotics, and firearms offenses.
These gang members do not belong on our streets. Instead, they belong exactly where they're going, to federal prison for many years, where they won't be surrounded by their buddies, they won't be close to their families, and they'll no longer be free to terrorize the neighborhoods in which they grew up.
So I don't know how many of you have ever listened to our podcast Intercepted, but thank you. When we were starting a podcast for the Intercept, we were thinking about what we wanted the audio to sound like, and I was very excited that Paul Miller, aka DJ Spooky, agreed to, for a very, very, very small amount of money, agreed to do all of the sound elements for our show. And there was a whole process that went into talking with DJ Spooky, with Paul, about the kind of sound that we wanted. And it went through multiple iterations. And I don't know how many of you know Paul's work beyond hearing it on our show. But to call him DJ Spooky, I feel is like too simple of an explanation. Paul is he's an audio and visual scientist. This is a guy who took D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation, totally remixed it, reimagined it, and cut it in a way that was emphasizing the history of white supremacy in this country. In fact, the first time that I briefly met Paul, he won't remember this, but I was with my mentor, my hero, my dear friend, Amy Goodman. I was working, and she's here tonight, by the way. Amy Goodman is where is Amy, by the way? Right here, right over here, of course. Come here, Amy, come here. Come here for 1 second. Come here. I want to hand the mic to Amy for 1 minute just to say hello. This is my teacher. I didn't graduate from college. I was a dropout, and I list my university as Democracy Now! Because I studied journalism under Amy Goodman, and it's everything I know. The way a plumber learns to be a plumber, I learned to be a journalist under Amy Goodman.
I just have 3 words to say to you and to Betsy and Liliana and Naomi and all of the folks here that are so amazing.
Glenn is also,
he's
on with Bill O'Reilly.
Happy birthday!
Amy and I went, and I met Paul because Amy was going to cover the fact that Lincoln Center was doing this screening of Paul's re-edit, remastering, remixing of Birth of a Nation. And I'm so honored to work with someone of Paul's caliber. He's going to be going soon to Mali to do a project where they're going to map all of these ancient texts, and he's going to be the resident DJ of that project. He does things for National Geographic, totally reimagining the role that sound plays in our life. And also, Paul is a classic anti-fascist. He is an anti-authoritarian. And he is an absolute brilliant artist to work with. And I want to hand the mic and the program over right now to my good friend, Paul Miller, AKA DJ Spooky. No, your mic is there. That's your mic.
Yo, Brooklyn, what's up, y'all? Hey. So, wait, Jeremy, before you head out, I want to just say, the first time I checked out your stuff was Dirty Wars. And how many of you guys checked out Dirty Wars? That's some shit, man. You got to remember, this is like an insane moment in human history where the basic premise of time and like how people are engaging technology and, of course, democracy, these are under a massive, massive attack. To have a functioning democracy, you need a well-informed populace. And obviously, that's not a Fox News agenda. So for me, at least, reading some of Jeremy's books really inspired me. And I'm a big fan of other authors who really triangulate between some of the issues around politics and, above all, how these things kind of spread with the geopolitical scenario. So when they asked for me to do the music for the podcast, it was a real pleasure. And I've worked with Public Enemy. Some of you might know the Millennials. I'm sorry, you know. There was a band called Public Enemy. And there's also other groups like Metallica or Yoko Ono, who I've also worked with. So, you know, it was a real pleasure to kind of think about a podcast as this platform for social change. So I've been a big fan of Jeremy's work, and actually Amy Goodman, she's over there. Wow, just incredible. So you guys, this is like, if we were in hip hop, it'd be like Wu-Tang and Public Enemy in the same room.
I'm gonna exit stage, whatever this is now.
All right, so what we're going to do here for a second...
I just got compared to Wu-Tang Clan, but... Oh, you can hear
Public
this?
Enemy.
Oh, sorry.
And Public Enemy. So, you know, it's one of those moments where you look at the 21st century and you realize it's all about storytelling on one level or another. Let me look at Google here. It's been a couple hundred days since Trump has been in office, which has been the hellish landscape of time just getting distorted. It's like you're at the worst airport in the world. Okay, 2 years, 86 days, 8 hours, 49 minutes, and 16 seconds of Trump administration. I know, it's hell, right? So the one way that I think the left has to really help kind of mediate and sometimes create new narratives is the arts, which is actually ignored in a lot of political discourse. You'd be surprised. So meanwhile, I grew up in Washington, D.C., where we had Ronald Reagan, who was a lunatic, and Mayor Marion Barry, who was also a lunatic. So growing up near Connecticut and R, you had bands like Bad Brains. I don't know if anybody remembers. All right, yeah. And you also had bands like Fugazi. So that was a kind of a downtown DC thing. And so for me at least, seeing the Intercept coming up was a real pleasure because they combined many of the issues that as a kid, I was growing up thinking that there needed to be a better sense of literature about change. So I'm going to invite Mr. Reed on stage. He's an artist who I'm producing a track with right now. And we work with the Brooklyn Youth Chorus, which if you haven't heard them, they're incredible. We got some fans, all right. And Michelle Alexander, whose book, The New Jim Crow. Boom. So Michelle's book is the libretto for this piece. It premiered at BAM and a couple other spots, and we had the Brooklyn Youth Chorus sing Prison Statistics, which is not the most wildly liberating and like fun song, but what we're going to do is kind of break it down a little bit. So Michelle's work, if you haven't checked it out, it's called The New Jim Crow. It's a best-selling book on the kind of prison industrial system and for-profit system. But we also think that sometimes it's better to put things in a song that will help people understand some of the dynamics. So what we're going to do is do a kind of a song around it. So Mr. Reed, thanks for coming out.
Good evening.
I know the ways of a sinner, but I'ma come back home. Oh, I'll come back home. And I know the ways of a sinner, but I wanna come back home. Oh, I wanna come back home. I feel it in my head now. Feel it in my soul now. Feel it in the water, yeah, all over this land. Said I feel it in my spirit, oh, I feel it in my soul now. I feel it in my hand, all over this land.
Yes. Despite these inconvenient truths, despite the Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
I'm from Brooklyn.
So, thank you. Boom. So, Jeremy, yo, that was some hip hop.
I want to ask you a couple things before you depart the stage. Explain to folks here what you're doing in Mali coming up.
Okay. Mali is at the edge of the Saharan Desert. You have to imagine there's a colonial situation going on in Morocco, which many Americans have never. What's Morocco? You know, it's like one of those things. And Timbuktu is one of the most remote cities in that region. So what I'm going to be doing is we're heading over there because there's been a lot of insurgencies and other issues happening where they're burning the libraries of Timbuktu. If anyone's into architecture and history, these are some of the oldest pre-Islamic libraries in sub-Saharan Africa. Regretfully, there's been a tremendous amount of politics and other issues happening where they've been burning the libraries because those are about exchange of information. So what we're going to be doing is going over there and scanning some of the oldest books of sub-Saharan Africa. And that's going to be happening May, June-ish. So thanks.
Also, briefly, we have some much younger people here. Some of us are getting gray, but we have much younger people here. explain what you did with, first explain what Birth of a Nation was, just briefly, and then explain what you did with it. Because this was so jolting and jarring to me as a young journalist to come and watch what you did with that piece, but just explain for people the original work and what you did with it.
All right, so again, millennials, there was a thing called film, right? Before Netflix, you know?
I usually tell a joke about a stamp. It would blow your mind. It's this piece of paper, you pull it off, you lick it.
No, it's real. I mean, so go back to 1915. Amusingly enough, there's another project I'm doing. 2019 is the 50th anniversary of this thing called the Internet. So 1969, you had a couple crazy things happening. You had Woodstock, you had a man on the moon, or a couple people on the moon, and you also had the first two hubs of the internet between Stanford Research Labs and UCLA. So to go back to Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith in 1915 created this thing called Hollywood. So what ended up happening is in the kind of construction of what people think about with roles, about women, about people of color, he used blackface. And blackface actually, for better or for worse, became one of America's most well-known pop culture phenomena. So for me, at least as an artist, to deconstruct that and interrogate the history of that with film is a fascinating kind of remix of how we think about cinema and history and politics. So it's the first film to play at the White House. And President Woodrow Wilson, who probably Trump is like a little bit of a, anti-remix, I don't know, one of these weird, long story short, both like almost, I don't even know, long story. So 1915, this film comes out, and it was highly controversial because it showed people of color getting elected to office, and a mixed race person gets elected to the highest office of that particular section of the country, and the white people start flipping out and say, oh, we have to have KKK, boom. So meanwhile, now we have Spike Lee with Black Klansman, for example, or Boots Riley has a great film called Sorry to Bother You, boom. So cinema has had a long evolution looking at perspective. It's about the politics of perception. And the politics of perception, as we all in this room probably agree with, can actually shape elections, can shape what we think of as democracy. Democracy is a very, very fragile thing. It's based on perception. A lot of it's based on information. So Griffith really found like the toxic cocktail and was able to really figure out some, for better, for worse, things like he innovated in cinema to bring home a certain message. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, you had people like Sergei Eisenstein. You had, there's a really good book called The Commissar Vanishes about the history of erasure. And the Soviets got really good. If you crossed Stalin, they would erase you. And if you crossed Stalin again, well, you were dead. So you were dead and erased. But in the US, you became blackface. It was like a kind of a double toxic cocktail. So for me, at least, if you look at people like Leni Riefenstahl, Sergei Eisenstein, and D.W. Griffith, one could argue that cinema has been the hidden architecture of how we think about politics of the last century. So, for example, you could start a war, Vietnam, for example, with the Tonkin Gulf incident, where you create a fictional incident, or you can, for example, the Iraq War, one could argue, was also, remember the smoking gun or the smoking nuclear cloud over whatever? Most of that, of course, we're still here, and the war is still going on, by the way.
Well, here's how that worked. Dick Cheney calls up Judy Miller, and he says, oh my God, there's going to be a mushroom cloud. Right. Then Judy Miller publishes it in the New York Times. Then Dick Cheney goes on Meet the Press, and they say, well, the New York Times is reporting a mushroom cloud. And Dick Cheney says, well, it must be true then.
Right. So, imagine, did anybody see the film Vice? Actually, that was kind of solid. I like that film. So, it had some issues. Christian Bale, I remember him more from like Less Than Zero.
Next week, there will be no more DJ Spooky.
So imagine like how cinema shapes memory in our time. So YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and so on, all of which you can have algorithmic now computational propaganda. And these are things that, Jeremy, you've explored extensively in your work. So people can really be manipulated by many of these issues. But again, cinema was one of the first areas where this would come home to roost. So 1915, the Soviets, the Americans, we all were trying to figure this out. And so I wanted to remix that as a statement about, the politics of perception. And then my friend Shep Ferry is right out there. If you haven't seen his stuff, he did the Obey poster. If you don't, so yeah, lots of going on.
If you haven't heard of Paul Miller, DJ Spooky's work, make sure that you check it out. You can hear him every week also on
on the podcast. Boom.
Intercepted.
So,
At the end of the show,
Intercepted.
we always say our music, as always, was composed by DJ Spooky.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you very much, Paul. So, an area of coverage that we didn't set out to focus on at the very, very beginning, and this was one of the fuck-ups, one of the mistakes that we made, was climate. And we ended up bringing on board Naomi Klein, who had been my colleague and Betsy's colleague at the Nation magazine. And, you know, I think a lot of people view Naomi Klein as, oh, she's the climate change person. Naomi Klein's first book, No Logo, took on the overwhelming power that corporations have over the lives of so many people around the globe, but also she began the first very serious investigation in any kind of a mass consumption way of corporate globalization and also speaking for anti-corporate globalization and those movements. And the thing is that from the instant success that she had with her book, No Logo, Naomi could have just cruised the rest of her life off of that work. But she hit the third rail in her next book when she started taking on the war industry in this country and in countries around the world. And her book, The Shock Doctrine, it remains one of the most important analyses of how the US government became what it's become in the current era, but also looking at this nexus between that exists that involves corporate power, powerful lobbying entities, the war industry, the duopoly in Washington. And she's continued to press ahead. Wrote one of the first books about what the Trump administration did in Puerto Rico, where Donald Trump's response boiled down to throwing paper towels at people and engaging in a colonialist mentality of Puerto Rico, but also the response to Puerto Rico. The idea that Trump was doing them a favor by even lifting a finger when Puerto Rico was utterly devastated. For the next discussion that we're going to have here, we're going to have Naomi Klein, our editor-in-chief Betsy Reed, and also the brilliant artist, thinker, author, Molly Crabapple. I want to welcome to the stage Molly, Betsy, and Naomi. I'll also say, as they're coming onto the stage, I accidentally have a tattoo on my left arm that Molly Crabapple drew. We were in a bar one night. I was telling her a story about the Irish that came to the United States, got sent down to Mexico, and then flipped sides in the Mexican-American War and fought with the Mexicans. That turned into a tattoo on my arm. Please don't talk anymore about this story. Anyway, okay. I hand it off now for a much more serious discussion. I'll see you later.
Thank you, Jeremy. Hello. Is this mic work? Yes. So that was a pretty great introduction of both of these amazing women who came together to work, as I mentioned at the outset, on an incredibly exciting new project that we're going to premiere tonight. Just to tell you a little bit more about each of them. Molly is an artist and a writer. Her inspirations include Diego Rivera and Goya's Disasters of War. Her newest publication project, Brothers of the Gun, is an illustrated collaboration with the Syrian war journalist Marwan Hisham and it was published by Chris Jackson's One World imprint at Penguin Random House, and has been longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award. Her memoir, Drawing Blood, received global praise and attention, and her reportage has been published in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Paris Review, Vanity Fair, The Guardian, Vice, and many other places. She is currently the Spring 2019 Artist in Residence at NYU's Hagop Kevorkian Center for Near Eastern Studies. And she's just spectacularly talented, and we're so thrilled to be collaborating with her. Naomi Klein, in addition to having written those books Jeremy was telling you about, is a senior correspondent at the Intercept, and also the inaugural Gloria Steinem Endowed Chair of Media, Culture, and Feminist Studies at Rutgers University. We're very happy that that has brought her to this country from Canada. She's an award-winning journalist, and her most recent book was The Battle for Paradise, which actually grew out of a story she wrote for The Intercept about Puerto Rico. And she's written No Is Not Enough, which is a great short book about the Trump era. So this is a very exciting moment for us and for you. You don't know it yet, but it is, because you're about to see this film that is a collaboration between Molly, Naomi, and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. And we're just beyond thrilled to be bringing it to you tonight and to the world tomorrow. People worked really, really hard to get it ready for this event. And just before you watch it, Naomi's going to give a little context for the film.
Sure. Well, hi everyone. It is so great to be here and to sort of see you out there. And there's no great story. There's no war zone injury related to why I'm on crutches, but I'm on the mend. And this is a really, it's nerve-wracking, butterflies. And it's such an honor to be here with Molly Crabapple and to be able to offer you all a sneak preview. You're the first people in the world to see this film that I just want to give you a little bit of backstory. The film speaks for itself, but I want to tell you a little bit about how it came about, which is that in December, the debate about the Green New Deal was starting to heat up. And it was starting to get ugly. And as you all know, for the past 4 months, it has been attacked by the serious center and the far right and the absolutely unhinged right, and here and there from the left with some legitimate critiques. But for those of us who really want the Green New Deal to succeed, want it to be the best that it possibly can be, see it as basically our last hope for a livable planet, Molly and I were thinking about how do we kind of do an end run around this misinformation campaign and produce some art and involve artists in the Green New Deal itself. And what Molly and I were talking about is that, first of all, art is low carbon work. These are green jobs. Green jobs aren't just guys putting up solar panels. And when we think back to the original New Deal in the 1930s, one of the things that was really amazing about it was that it led to this renaissance of publicly funded art. Hundreds of thousands of murals, all of these incredible films and theater pieces, and artists were treated as workers like any other. The original New Deal was also under relentless attack by the press. There was actually a coup, a sloppy coup, a banker's coup to try to overthrow FDR. The reason why it didn't matter and the popularity still soared was, first of all, it was helping people, but also it had its own communication. And artists were out there, and they were all in for the Green New Deal. And so Molly said, I would love to make a video with AOC. And we started thinking about what that should communicate and what we should be trying to do. And what we realized was that the biggest problem we are up against when we think about doing something as transformative as science demands is the sense of futility that people have because they're told all the time that it's impossible, that they're just greedy, that they're just going to spend their whole lives on the couch watching walruses commit suicide on Netflix and just, let the whole thing wash over them. And it's almost like people think that they don't deserve to be saved. And The Intercept had just a few days earlier published this really wonderful piece by Kate Aronoff, one of our fantastic reporters and writers, and who's been a really important theorist for the Green New Deal. And Kate set this piece in the future, in the year 2045, and she told the story of a fictional young woman named Gina who lived in the world that the Green New Deal created. And it really struck a chord with you readers of The Intercept. And we realized that it was because it was imagining a future that was actually non-apocalyptic, that did not take the apocalypse for granted, like almost every big-budget Hollywood film that we've ever seen, that just imagines the future as like Mad Max, trying to protect your kids from, cannibals and, warlords, right? So that was what inspired this film. And I'm going to stop talking and let the film talk.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here.
So great. When I first saw just the storyboard for this concept, it actually brought tears to my eyes, and like every time I see it, it just gives me chills. I'm so thrilled to have been a part of this incredible project with you guys, and I would like to acknowledge some of the people who made this possible, which was not easy, and it kind of came together around the time of this event, so we decided that it would be really nice to show it to you guys tonight, but that required some around-the-clock work by the co-directors, Kim Bookbinder and Jim Batt. Woo! And Avi Lewis, who's the co-writer and producer. Husband of Naomi, last but not least. You guys did an amazing job. Lauren Feeney, who's a director of video production at The Intercept, oversaw the whole thing, so that was so fantastic. And Molly just brought her incredible brilliance and humanity and vision to this project, and we're just so grateful. So I thought maybe we could start by just having you speak a little bit about why this idea formed, why it felt like an important intervention at this moment for you.
Thank you so much. Before I talk about that, I just want to acknowledge the work of my partners in this, Kim Bookbinder and Jim Batt. Again, we've created videos for the last 8 years together, and everything that you see on the screen, it's just because you see my hand in it, it doesn't mean that it's just me. It's all three of us. Every single line is something that we all did together. they're geniuses. My father is from Puerto Rico, and after Hurricane Maria, I got on the first plane I could back to report, and I kept going back. And one of the things that struck me about what happened after Maria, in addition to all of the horrible things we know, not just about the storm, but about the neglect and about the racism, the way that colonialism, beat that island, in addition to that, one of the things that struck me were these centers that people set up called Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, which people set up to feed each other, to clear the roads, to check in on sick and elderly people. And these centers, in addition to kind of keeping the island alive when no one else gave a crap about it, they were also places of beauty. They were places where when people lined up for arroz con gandules, there was a guy playing music so that they weren't bored online. And it got me thinking about how important beauty is and how much we need beauty and we need art when we talk about change. How beauty is not just a reason to fight, but also a way of fighting. And that was something that really influenced us in creating this film. As Naomi said, we see so much apocalypse and so much dystopia, but we see very little utopia. We see very few glimpses of how things might be better. It's almost like this foreclosing of imagination, a way of not allowing us to think big. And what we wanted to create, what me and Kim and Jim and Naomi and Avi and Alexandria wanted to create, was we wanted to show that the Green New Deal didn't just mean sacrifice. It didn't just mean like not eating hamburgers. It also meant that the world could be more beautiful and it could be better and it could be more humane. I think about one piece that I did. It's the last piece, the last slide, which is my kind of vision of how do I put this, futuristic green Grand New Concourse in the Bronx. I never wanted a future that looked like Dubai. I never wanted a future where it was all just, glass and, sleek glass buildings where there's no place for the birds to live. I wanted a future that had all of the beauty of our old world, but made and adopted for what we're trying to create. And so when we created this, that's what we were thinking of. Thank you so much.
Naomi, you went to Puerto Rico about 6 months after Hurricane Maria to do a reporting trip. And you also spent time at the same time that the island was totally devastated, you found these little mini utopias of collective action. And that is present here in this story too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both of us have been really shaped by that experience. And when I spoke to a lot of Puerto Ricans about, well, what's the vision for the future? A lot of people talked about the past, and that it was a kind of paradise that was destroyed, and that it's not just about turning back the clock, but it isn't about blanking the slate either, right? That there's so much knowledge that was erased, and that is what made the island so vulnerable. So one example is agriculture, right? Where Puerto Rico, the Hurricane Maria just swept through these monocrops like a scythe, right? So if you're only growing bananas or you're only growing coffee, and you don't have any trees, you don't have any protection from winds, then when these high winds come, it just destroys everything. And this is what the U.S. government, told Puerto Ricans to do, right? Grow cash crops for export, import the rest of your food. They import 90% of their food, more than that, in an island that's incredibly fertile. But it turned out that the people who actually had food when the whole system collapsed were the people who had kept some of that old knowledge alive, who practiced what's called agroecological farming, which is just like a fancy way of saying, a mix of older indigenous methods with newer technologies. So what does that knowledge tell you? It tells you to intercrop. Don't plant just a monocrop. Keep some trees, right? Because then everything won't get swept away when it rains. And plant root vegetables as well as things above ground, because the soil is a natural bunker, right? So I had that experience where it was like, I called it Battle for Paradise, because you had this one version of so-called Puertopia, which was the crypto guys, and it was exactly that blank slate idea. And then the other side of it was, this picking up the pieces, starting not from scratch, but from scrap, I guess. And that phrase comes to mind when I look at Molly's art, where it is that the opposite. Whenever anybody tells you that they see a blank canvas, be very afraid. And that's what the governor of Puerto Rico was going around telling all business people in New York City, come to Puerto Rico, it's a blank canvas, right? I heard that in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina from people who sounded just like him. It's a blank slate, right? It was actually rubble, right? I mean, there were still bodies in the streets, and they were calling it a blank slate. So, it is a battle. It is a battle, right? There are all these different visions, but Puerto Ricans have been coming up with their own vision of a Green New Deal. They've been coming together. That's why we did the book. That's why we did that little book. All the money went to a coalition of 60 Puerto Rican groups that had come together to fight for their vision of the island. So we are learning from them, and so it's really great to have that presence. To have this film come from two women who trace their family roots back to Puerto Rico. It's not for nothing.
It seems like on many fronts there's a sort of struggle between the doubters who are, may kind of agree, yes, there's a climate crisis-ish, but, this is too much, too fast. People are not ready. So is this, in a way, an answer to that? It's like the sort of the Dianne Feinstein, narrowness of vision versus people like, Greta Thunberg, who has... Naomi has a special affection for her.
We all do, it seems, yes.
I just think the idea that we should, get used to our houses burning down every year, just be submissive to that, it's ridiculous, right? Saying that this is moving too fast is essentially just submitting to your own destruction. So I think of this both as a warning, but also as saying that we can do great things. We have done great things in the past. Humanity is capable of doing great things. We do not have to have this crabbed little vision where we're like, okay, I guess we live in a world where our houses are just destroyed by hurricanes and we can live in tent cities in Walmart. We don't have to do that, We can create a better world, and that's what this is trying to show.
It's our green dream. We're taking it back from Nancy Pelosi.
So just, I think we're short on time, alas, but one more question, which is, just about the role of the journalist and the writer and the artist in a political movement. I mean, a lot of times journalists, who fashion themselves as impartial, often mainstream, try to pretend they don't have biases. And artists likewise, there's a tension between art and politics. But here we really see, an embrace of a very engaged form of art and journalism. And that is, at its root, what the Intercept does in our work. We're not afraid to be honest about our point of view. We believe in being faithful to the facts, but we want to be open about how we feel about those facts, how those feelings and convictions motivate what we choose to do and spend our lives focusing on. And I think that this film, even though it is a departure in form from what we do day to day at The Intercept, is like a perfect embodiment of that spirit. So do you guys have any last thoughts about that?
I think artists and journalists, we actually have two different ways that we're not supposed to be political. Artists are supposed to be these unworldly idiot savants kind of creating the same work and then selling them to oligarchs until they die. Whereas journalists are supposed to be white men in suits who view everything from nowhere. They're different roles, both equally ridiculous. Everyone is connected with the world. We all have things that we want to happen in the world and things that we don't want to happen. We all stand in a certain place, artists, journalists, just like we're both normal humans. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with creating work that is engaged with the world, as long as you do it with rigor and with honesty and with discipline towards the truth.
I mean, I agree completely, and I've always felt that if you're going to try to put radical ideas out into the world, then the onus is on you to do even more homework, do even more research, be even more bulletproof, because it's a goddamn war. If you understand the way power works, then you understand how important it is that when you are out there and making these cases, that you don't leave yourself open, you don't leave yourself vulnerable to easy dismissals, because that is not fair to your cause, right? So I'm really lucky that I was, there have always been these traditions, right? And they get erased. And that's part of what we're trying to revive. Like the idea of artists and journalists being part of social movements. Every single movement has had journalists and writers and journals and publications that were embedded in them. We're trying to remind people of that deep history in this country, because it gets erased. It doesn't get taught in school. I mean, people are shocked to remember how central the arts and journalism was to the transformation of this country during the New Deal. Because it just gets erased, right? So we have to revive that history, but it doesn't mean that we're making propaganda. So there's a real difference there. And the way I see the work that is that this project is a part of, and that so much of our work needs to be a part of, is the legacy of we are talking in the rubble of the neoliberal project, which has dominated for 50 years, and barely anybody defends the policies anymore. People don't stand before you and go, you know what, we should just privatize everything. That will work out really well, right? Or we will, they don't have the strength of their convictions. But the sturdiest part of the neoliberal project is the atrophying of the imagination. This is what we're living through with the Green New Deal. It is the legacy of there is no alternative. If you try to do anything better then this bleak reality will just end up as tyranny, right? And that lack of imagination, we now have generations who've grown up in it. But I really do believe that there is a new generation out there, and I think climate change, the stakes of the climate crisis is animating. You mentioned Greta. Think of 1.6 million young people went on strike from school last month, right? And they're not stopping, And so, I think what they're seeing is if playing by the rules and status quo leads to the destruction of our habitat and just this arson of all that is precious, then they're ready to break the rules. And we all have to be ready to break the rules. That's the moment that we're in. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for everything you do and for this incredible work of art. So proud to have it.
All right, thank you very much, Betsy Reed, Naomi Klein, Molly Crabapple. We have reached the end of the evening. Glenn is now done with all Fox News appearances, and he's gonna kick my ass for this. This is unbelievable. Yes, I've just been waiting for all of it. His name is Glenn Greenwald. He was a blogger. Oh, there he is. Sorry. All right. Actually, I do want to say one thing before I bring Glenn on. I have been, as Mehdi Hassan has been, and I want to share with you guys, because it's only those of us in this room and whoever's watching on the internet right now, which could be anyone. I want to share with you something, though, personal, which is that I've argued with Glenn for many months now about his appearances on Fox News, and I'm not going to do that tonight. Glenn has his position, I have my position, but I want to say one thing. Glenn's husband, David Miranda, is an incredible activist, and his life story is utterly powerful. David grew up in a favela in Brazil, what is referred to as the roughest, poorest favela. And David rose through the ranks. He became a city councilman in Rio, and when a member of the Congress a few months ago in Brazil was forced by threats, including the threat of death, to leave his post and flee the country because of the rising tide of fascism in Brazil, David took his position in Congress. And both Glenn and David have been subject to death threats, real death threats, because there is a Trump-backed fascist right now in power in Brazil. And while I have disagreed with many of Glenn's appearances on Fox News, I will say this in defense of my friend and brother, Glenn Greenwald. Glenn went on Laura Ingram's show on Fox News, which is one of the most watched programs in this country. And this happened a few weeks ago. And Glenn was supposed to be on that show to attack Nancy Pelosi. Glenn was asked a question by Laura Ingraham that he refused to answer. Instead, Glenn answered the question that he thought should have been asked, which was, who is Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil, and what do people in this country need to know? And what Glenn did during those minutes on Fox News was to absolutely obliterate the fascist regime of Jair Bolsonaro on what amounts to state media for the Trump administration. And he did something that I think was the absolute bravest intervention on media this year in this country. So I radically disagree with Glenn's decision to go on Tucker Carlson's show and not call out Fox News. His decision to go on Laura Ingram's show and say what he says there. I will set that aside and say this. What Glenn Greenwald did by going on Trump's network and calling out specifically what Bolsonaro was doing was unbelievably brave, because Bolsonaro was on right after Glenn. So I can have a debate with Glenn, and I think we should have that debate about what you do when you go on these fascist, white supremacist networks. And I think Glenn is wrong about this, and Glenn can say what he wants. But I want people who are criticizing Glenn on Twitter, who are criticizing Glenn without walking in the shoes he's walking in, to consider whether you would ever take that kind of personal risk to stand up against fascism, which Glenn did on Fox News. I'm going to have Glenn on my podcast to debate him on these issues. But I do want to say that Glenn and his husband David are in the crosshairs right now, receiving death threats, under pressure from a fascist organization that has seized control of Brazil with the full backing of the Trump administration. This is a serious situation that Glenn and his family are facing. And for all of my disagreements, I will say I have absolute respect for what Glenn did a couple of weeks ago when he went on Fox News and did something that you will never see on American television. So having said that, I want to welcome Glenn to the evening. Glenn, we have a packed house here at the Bell House. People are very excited to see you. Some people may be throwing things at the screen, but that's okay. Glenn, first of all, your thoughts now on 5 years of The Intercept, how it started, and what's happened since.
Yeah, so first of all, hello to everybody. I really wish I could have been there with you. I had planned to be there. I'm going to actually blame my children for my not being able to be there. They're absolutely wonderful, but they do complicate life a little bit. But I'm absolutely there in spirit. I've been watching the live stream of the event for the entire evening. And to be completely honest, I've been really moved emotionally from the start in a way that I didn't expect, because it made me reflect on everything that we've put into creating this new media outlet over the course of 5 years, and the extraordinary team of people, of editors and journalists and all kinds of support people who have made The Intercept not what we wanted it to be, but so much more and so much better. And it's been a hard path, but it's been an incredibly gratifying one. And I think in these cases, I really wanted to be there. I especially wanted to be there even more as I saw all night on Twitter all the jokes Jeremy was making at my expense. But, you know, with that introduction that Jeremy just gave and everything that preceded it with that extraordinary film that you saw, I feel like I am there because the energy and the ethos of what The Intercept was intended to become and what it has become is something that, because of this evening, I just feel more connected to than ever. And I know, like, in these kind of situations, you're supposed to think and say, oh my God, I can't believe it's been 5 years already. And I actually have exactly the opposite reaction when I realized it was 5 years, which is, God, I can't believe it's only been 5 years since we started. And it's not because, you know, it's such a long sludge or it's been so difficult. It hasn't been that for the most part. It's really because we immersed ourselves in this so completely and put so much of ourselves into it. And I think really kind of merged our life's work into what it has become, that I almost can't remember my life or even the world without The Intercept in it. So talking about it as being 5 years old seems almost bizarre to me. And I was, of course, because of this event, thinking back what the whole history has been. And I think there's so many things that make me really proud. I think the fact that when we began The Intercept, we had a list of who our dream hires would be. And so many of the people who were on that list were people who left their work to come and work with us and build what The Intercept has become and are still with it. People who are at the top of our list, like Liliana Segura and Lee Fang and Murtaza Hussein and Cora Courier. And then also on our list, this sort of dream list, were people like Naomi Klein and Mehdi Hassan and Jim Risen. And it took several years for us to get them, but we kept persisting and harassing them. And we finally did. And around this nucleus, we've built this extraordinary team of people that you're seeing tonight, and many of whom you're not. But, you know, what I was thinking about was when we began, we didn't have a very definitive idea of what we wanted to do. In fact, we were kind of naive and ignorant. We sort of came together like asteroids. It was like this excitement of almost like a childlike excitement, like, oh my God, we have this opportunity to create a media outlet that embodies and practices the journalism we've been saying for a decade we wished exist. And we just came together and said, let's do it. And then when we started doing it, we realized, you know what, actually creating a media outlet from scratch is a lot harder than you think it is if you've never done it before. I remember the day when I put together this beautiful list of all these amazing journalists that we wanted to get. And then I realized, ew, gross, we need editors, not just like star reporters. And the first year was filled with a lot of drama and a lot of kind of gossip, and a lot of that was publicized because not everybody in journalism was rooting for us to succeed. And I remember this conversation Jeremy and I had during that first year, at the end of that first year, where we said, look, if we just tune out everything that's happening, all the drama, all the publicity, all the gossip, all the bumps in the road, and just put our heads down and do great journalism like we set out to do when we created this, it's all going to work out perfectly. And if we don't, we're going to fail, and we deserve to. And I think that was really the key epiphany that led to all of this, was that everything is driven by the journalism. If you do great journalism, you're going to continue to grow, you're going to continue to get support, and you're going to be sustained. And, just sort of the last point I wanted to make is, if you look at recent events, I think you can kind of track the trajectory of the Intercept along with it. Like when you look at the fact that there are now 2 members of Congress, 2 newly elected young women of color who are explicit advocates of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, something that was utterly unthinkable. And, you see one of them, Ilhan Omar, who is an immigrant from Somalia, who every time she gets attacked, not only by the right, but sometimes even from within her own party, there's a huge segment of the political populace that defends her. And I don't think the Intercept is responsible for that. I don't think we created the climate in which that could happen, but I definitely think we have contributed to opening up the kind of discourse that has made what is allowed to be expressed a far wider range of ideas, perspectives, and opinions. And I think probably like embodying that for me is I spent 2018 being harassed to the point where I almost got a restraining order against one of my own colleagues, our Washington bureau chief, Ryan Grimm, because he would not stop bothering me about this obscure primary race that he was obsessed with in New York, that he kept telling me he was going to change politics forever. And I almost blocked him on Slack, which is our communications chat device that we use, because he wouldn't leave me alone. And finally, he got me to look at it, and I was blown away by what I saw. And when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat the 4th ranking member of the House Democratic Caucus, somebody who everybody thought was going to become Speaker of the House once Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer finally, whatever they do, go out to graze or floated away or whatever, there were like 2 or 3 media outlets in the entire country that had even heard of her. And we hadn't just heard of her, we had flooded the zone of coverage because we had a Washington politics team headed by Miriam and Ryan and other people that you've seen who are just looking at politics and journalism in a different way. And I realize now that although I probably wouldn't have articulated it this way 5 years ago, that more than anything is what we set out to do, is to create a media outlet and a team of journalists and editors, not who agree with one another on everything, as Jeremy just made very clear. We often do not. We don't agree ideologically, we don't agree politically, we don't agree journalistically, and I'm really glad we don't. I'm glad that we're confident enough as a media organization to debate things internally and have space for people to be free. But what I think we wanted, ultimately what we wanted to do more than anything, even though we may not have articulated it this way at the time, is find people who just look at politics and journalism and culture and humanity and our role in it just differently.
Glenn,
you just heard Molly and Naomi talking about imagination. I think that's been the key to what we tried to achieve.
Glenn, we only have a few moments left, but there's a couple things I want to ask you about. One is that Julian Assange now has been arrested and is facing extradition to the United States, and he's facing extradition not for anything related to Trump, Russia, Hillary, 2016, but at the beginning, a technical charge related to the WikiLeaks publications of State Department cables, Iraq and Afghanistan war logs. And of course, the United States could add charges on after it extradites Assange, if that happens. But what does this mean for press freedom and publication of secrets, documents, whistleblower testimony that's critical of the United States? Because let's be clear here, whatever you think about Julian Assange, what we are talking about here is a prosecution that is linked to the exposure of U.S. war crimes by WikiLeaks with the help of the source, Chelsea Manning, who, by the way, is being held in prison right now. She was sentenced to 35 years, did 7, had her sentence commuted by Obama, and is now back in prison for refusing to testify in a grand jury proceeding.
Right. Well, Jim Risen, who is, I'm thrilled to say now, our colleague, wrote an article at the beginning of the Trump administration in what I believe when he was still at the New York Times, he wrote it at the New York Times, and the headline of it was something like, "If Trump succeeds in attacking press freedom, thank Obama for that." And what he meant by that, as somebody who spent many years being threatened with prison by the Obama Justice Department for doing journalism, was that Obama had laid this framework that would allow his successor to destroy and erode severely press freedoms in all kinds of unimaginable ways. But even the Obama administration, which wanted to find a way to prosecute Julian Assange, concluded that there was no way to do it without criminalizing journalism, because, as Jeremy said, no matter what you think about Assange, what he did in the 2016 election, no matter what you think about the pending or the previously pending investigation in Sweden for rape and sexual assault, which this has nothing to do with, regardless of what you think of him, the indictment of him, the Obama Justice Department concluded, would have required a criminalization of all the things that journalists typically do, like encourage sources to get more documents, find ways to help sources remain anonymous. And the Trump Justice Department said, even though the Obama Justice Department was very hostile to press freedom, the tiny little bit that they cared about it, enough not to indict Julian Assange, we're going to dispense with that and create a theory that allows an indictment that essentially says that all the things that we at the Intercept do regularly, like find ways to protect sources, like encourage people to get documents, like enable them to do so without detection, we're going to call criminal. We're going to call part of a conspiracy with your source to steal information. And there's a consensus of press freedom groups. There's the ACLU, there's left-wing political parties all over the world, including here in Brazil, and even in the US, there's left-wing politicians who are recognizing for what this is, which is the really first step in attacking press freedoms by the Trump administration. Mean tweets about Wolf Blitzer and, Chuck Todd can make people hate the press, but this is a really full-on attack on press freedoms, purposely chosen to target somebody who they know a lot of people don't like, and therefore in the hopes that they'll just not care.
Glenn, I want to ask you, what, just very briefly, what's the most dangerous aspect of Donald Trump being president in your view?
Well, I thought that when he was running, the most dangerous aspect is the same thing that I think is true now. I think there's been a lot of checks on his presidency. You see a reawakened citizenry, a reawakened media, a reawakened judiciary that are providing checks on him. The U.S. has a lot of strong institutions. Even the CIA and the deep state are opposed. I think the most dangerous thing is the rhetoric and the way in which it gives license to people not just to express, but to act upon what have been sentiments that over the last 2 or 3 decades we've succeeded in making taboo. They're being brought to the fore in a really dangerous way, particularly the sentiments that are aimed at the most marginalized among us. And so I think even if he loses in 2020, I think even if that gets relegated as a political force, it's going to be really hard to undo that, because there's a movement now that has sprung up through his dangerous rhetoric that has become emboldened and empowered that was prior to his election pretty fringe and relegated to the margins. And I think that's the most dangerous and enduring part of his presidency.
And then final question here, Glenn. You're speaking to us right now from Brazil. Your husband, David, is a congressman. You and David both are in the crosshairs of the Brazilian paramilitary state now under Bolsonaro. What should people understand about what is happening, not just in Brazil, but around the world with this coalition of the willing authoritarians?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, Brazil is an extraordinarily important country. It gets nowhere near the attention it deserves, given that it's the 5th largest country in the world. It has the most important environmental resource on the planet, which is the Amazon. It has vast oil reserves. It's the 2nd largest country in the hemisphere. And it's been taken over by a leader who really isn't comparable to Donald Trump in terms of the danger he poses or even the ideological extremity he represents. He's more comparable to, say, like Sisi in Egypt or Duterte in the Philippines, and potentially even worse. One of the amazing things that I didn't talk about that I wanted to mention was that under Betsy Reed's leadership, we've been able to take the journalism of The Intercept and apply it to Brazil, a place that was even more lacking in the kind of aggressive adversarial journalism than the United States. And that's one of the reasons why David and I have become such targets, isn't just because of his role in the Congress, but because of the threat that The Intercept Brazil and this team of really brave young Brazilian journalists that we've hired and assembled and unleashed on this fascist movement, the threat that they represent has kind of spilled over to us. But I think you're exactly right that Bolsonaro is part of this broader movement that is largely the result of the failure of neoliberalism, which is as true here in Brazil as it is in Western and Eastern Europe and in the United States, where people are now willing to run into the arms of whoever it is that promises to destroy the system, because their hatred for the system is so great and so deep that even when Brazil didn't just overnight become a racist, xenophobic, homophobic, fascist country, they had elected center-left governments for 16 straight years, but they got to the point where they thought, just like so many other people in so many other countries have, that neoliberalism is helping a tiny portion of the population at the expense of everybody else, and therefore we're willing to empower whoever it is that vows to destroy that. And I think that's why our number one challenge, not as Americans, but just as humanity, is to start to come to grips with how much damage this prevailing ideology is wreaking on our politics, on our planet, on all of us as human beings, and the danger that unless we come to grips and come up with an alternative, there are going to be a lot more Bolsonaros, a lot more Dutertes, a lot more sissies in our future, and many, many worse ones. And that's how I see Brazil as part of this overall movement.
Glenn Greenwald, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Safe, brother. It's great to see you. All right, Jeremy, thanks.
We are almost at the end of our evening here. I want to bring Paul Miller, DJ Spooky back out. I also want to say that throughout the audience tonight, we have our colleagues from The Intercept, reporters, photographers, editors, technical people who make this all possible. So first, just a round of applause to all of the folks that make up The Intercept. I want to thank the Bell House for their hospitality here tonight. And finally, we have a membership program. When you see reporting that you like on the Intercept or that you believe in, whether it was Naomi Klein's or Liliana Segura's or Glenn's or mine or anyone else's, that reporting happens because of people who support this publication. We have tables outside if you want to sign up to become a member. We have hoodies, T-shirts, the whole drill that everybody always wants to talk about. No. All of those things are available, but really the point of it is that the people that support this publication keep it alive, and we want to thank all of you. I know that there are a lot of people in this room who are sustaining members of the Intercept, and you came here because you got an early email inviting you to this program. So thank you very much. We're going to go out with Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, and thank everyone for your support, for coming out, and for helping us mark 5 years of the Intercept. Thank you very much. Paul, it's on you. Thank you.